They say some voices are feared not because they shout, but because they refuse to be silenced. From the moment Minister Louis Farrakhan stepped onto the national stage, he positioned himself as a challenge to the political, media, and cultural order of the United States, not with weapons, not with violence, but with words, ideas, and an unwavering sense of purpose. He openly claimed that powerful institutions wanted to discredit him, marginalize him, or erase his influence because his message disrupted narratives carefully maintained for generations. Farrakhan did not speak only about race. He spoke about power, about who defines truth, who controls history, and who decides which voices are acceptable and which must be framed as dangerous. At home, he questioned systemic inequality, economic dependency, and the psychological legacy of slavery. Abroad, he criticized U.S. foreign policy and moral authority, arguing that a nation cannot claim righteousness while ignoring its own historical wounds. For supporters, this made him a truth teller. For critics, it made him unsettling. What truly set him apart was his refusal to soften his stance to gain approval. He did not rely on mainstream validation. He did not seek comfort in popularity. Instead, he appealed directly to people who felt unheard, calling for self-discipline, self-reliance, and dignity. That independence is precisely what made him controversial. A voice that cannot be easily controlled, edited, or redirected is always a concern to established power. This story is not about agreeing with everything Farrakhan has ever said. It is about understanding why his presence continues to provoke strong reactions decades later, why mention of his name still sparks debate, and why some voices are labeled dangerous simply for refusing to conform. If you're interested in exploring the ideas behind the controversy and thinking critically about power, fear, and free expression, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the full story. Building on that challenge to power, Farrakhan shifts the focus away from institutions and toward the lived reality of Black communities themselves. He speaks not in abstract theory, but in the language of consequence. He points to a quiet crisis that rarely dominates headlines, a deep, internal despair reflected in rising suicide, persistent poverty, fractured families, and an overwhelming presence of Black men in prisons. For him, these are not isolated social failures or moral shortcomings. They are symptoms of a long historical pressure that has never truly been released. He reminds audiences that this despair did not appear overnight. It did not emerge from a lack of talent, intelligence, or ambition. Instead, it grew from centuries of enforced exclusion, broken promises, and systems that offered survival but rarely dignity. When Farrakhan speaks of history, he does not treat it as a distant memory sealed in textbooks. He presents it as a living force, shaping how people see themselves, how communities function, and how hope is distributed unevenly across society. In his view, a people repeatedly told they are lesser will eventually internalize that message unless something intervenes. What unsettles many listeners is that Farrakhan refuses to reduce this crisis to external blame alone. While he is unflinching in his criticism of racism and injustice, he also turns the mirror inward. He argues that waiting endlessly for recognition or rescue has become its own trap, quietly draining initiative and self-belief. To him, despair deepens when people are convinced that solutions must always come from outside forces that neither understand nor prioritize their survival. This is where his message diverges sharply from the narratives often assigned to him. He insists that his words are not fueled by resentment, but by urgency. He frames discipline, responsibility, and self-respect not as punishment, but as tools of recovery. In his storytelling, dignity is something rebuilt daily through action, through economic cooperation, moral accountability, classism, and the decision to value one's own life and community. He speaks of freedom not as a slogan, but as a demanding condition that requires courage and effort. Farrakhan often contrasts the present moment with earlier periods of extreme hardship, pointing out that even under brutal conditions, there was a shared sense of purpose and endurance that kept communities intact. What troubles him most about the modern crisis is not hardship alone, but hopelessness, belief that no path forward exists. When people no longer see a future worth building, destruction turns inward. His argument is simple but unsettling. A system that benefits from dependence has little incentive to encourage true independence, and a people deprived of self-confidence are easier to manage. In this context, his proposals are framed as solutions rather than attacks. He speaks of economic self-sufficiency as a way to restore pride, of education as a means of self-definition rather than assimilation, and of unity as protection against isolation. Even when discussing separation or reparative justice, he presents these ideas as responses to failure, not declarations of hostility. If reconciliation has stalled, he asks, why pretend otherwise? Why not confront reality honestly and negotiate a future rooted in fairness and mutual respect? Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, the emotional force of his message lies in its refusal to accept despair as inevitable. Farrakhan tells a story in which survival is not enough, where dignity must be reclaimed deliberately, and where solutions begin with the courage to name the problem without fear. That insistency in confronting pain directly while demanding responsibility explains why his message resonates deeply with some and disturbs others. It challenges both the comfort of denial and the ease of dependency, leaving listeners with an uncomfortable question. What happens when a people decide they will no longer wait to be saved? As this story unfolds, it becomes clear that the unease surrounding Farrakhan did not emerge from a single speech or moment, but from a pattern that stretched across decades. His rhetoric was never designed to comfort institutions that thrived on gradual change and controlled dissent. Instead, it confronted the foundations of power directly, questioning not only policies, but the moral standing of the nation itself. That directness, delivered without apology, is what consistently unsettled mainstream institutions and advocacy groups. Farrakhan spoke in a register that many were unprepared to engage. He did not frame injustice as an unfortunate deviation from American ideals, but as evidence of contradictions embedded within them. When he addressed white supremacy, he did so not as a fringe concept or a relic of the past, but as an enduring structure that shaped economics, politics, and culture. His language stripped away the comfort of distance, forcing listeners to confront the idea that inequality was not accidental, nor fully resolved by symbolic progress. For institutions invested in narratives of steady improvement, this framing felt disruptive. What amplified that discomfort was his challenge to moral authority. Farrakhan repeatedly questioned whether a nation with a history of slavery, segregation, and global intervention could position itself as a neutral judge of justice. This was not a rejection of dialogue, but a demand for honesty. He argued that moral leadership requires accountability, and accountability begins with acknowledging harm rather than managing its appearance. For advocacy groups accustomed to working within established frameworks, this approach posed a dilemma. Engaging him risked legitimizing critiques they could not easily counter, while ignoring him risked confirming his claims. The reaction was often to reframe the conversation, rather than addressing the substance of his arguments. Critics focused on tone, presentation, or perceived extremity. Farrakhan became less a speaker with ideas and more a symbol to be managed. Universities debated whether he should be allowed a platform. Media appearances were carefully controlled, often structured to contain rather than explore his positions. The fear was not simply of disagreement, but of resonantia, of what might happen if his words reached audiences without mediation. This tension reflected a deeper anxiety about influence. Farrakhan demonstrated an ability to mobilize people outside traditional political channels, speaking directly to those who felt excluded from mainstream representation. His emphasis on independence, economic, psychological, and cultural challenged systems that depended on managed participation rather than autonomous action. To institutions built on incremental reform, such independence appeared unpredictable, even destabilizing. It suggested a shift in power that could not be easily negotiated. Yet what made his rhetoric especially potent was its consistency. Over time, historical events seemed to echo his warnings. Persistent inequality, cycles of incarceration, and ongoing global conflicts lent weight to his critiques of moral credibility. For supporters, this consistency signaled integrity. For critics, It intensified concern, a message that does not fade with time, but adapts and endures, becomes harder to dismiss as momentary provocation. Farrakhan's refusal to dilute his language further widened the divide. He rejected the idea that truth must be softened to be acceptable, arguing instead that discomfort was often the first step toward awareness. In doing so, he challenged a culture that increasingly equated civility with silence and progress with patience. His speeches reminded audiences that history's most transformative ideas were rarely welcomed when first spoken. The alarm among institutions was therefore not rooted solely in disagreement, but in recognition. Farrakhan exposed vulnerabilities within the narratives that sustained authority. He questioned who benefits from moderation, who defines legitimacy, and who decides when critique becomes unacceptable. By doing so, he forced a confrontation between appearance and reality, between declared values and lived experience. In the broader arc of this story, his rhetoric serves as a mirror. It reflects a society wrestling with its image and its conscience, unsure whether to engage the reflection or shatter the glass. Farrakhan's words, uncompromising and persistent, continue to linger not because they are universally embraced, but because they refuse to disappear, and it is often what cannot be erased that power fears most. Against this backdrop of institutional unease and moral confrontation, Farrakhan's emphasis on black self-reliance, self-discipline, and accountability emerges as one of the most defining and divisive elements of his message. It is here that opposition to him becomes more complex, extending beyond political elites to include figures within the black leadership class itself. His words do not merely challenge external power, they unsettle internal comfort zones, disrupting familiar roles shaped by decades of dependence on established systems. Farrakhan's argument is rooted in a simple but demanding premise. Freedom carries responsibility. He insists that liberation cannot be sustained if it is outsourced to governments, corporations, or symbolic gestures. While acknowledging the weight of historical injustice, he warns that focusing solely on external blame risks turning pain into paralysis. In his storytelling, self-discipline is not about moral judgment, but about reclaiming control over one's direction in a society that has long denied it. This insistence often provokes discomfort because it removes the refuge of passivity. The 1995 Million Man March crystallized this philosophy in a way few events ever have. Rather than a protest fueled by anger, it was framed as a moment of reflection and renewal. Farrakhan called on black men to examine their roles as fathers, partners, workers, and community builders. He spoke of reconciliation not as submission, but as accountability to one's own people. For supporters, the gathering symbolized dignity and unity without reliance on official approval. For critics, it raised concerns precisely because it demonstrated how many people were willing to respond to a call that bypassed conventional leadership structures. This bypassing of intermediaries is key to understanding the resistance he faced. Political systems often prefer negotiators who translate demands into manageable terms. Farrakhan, however, addressed people directly, asking them to change their behavior, their priorities, and their sense of self-worth before demanding change from others. That approach left little room for gatekeepers. It suggested that power could be cultivated from the ground up without permission. Such a possibility naturally unsettled those accustomed to shaping outcomes from the top down. Some black leaders found his message equally challenging. Farrakhan questioned whether symbolic inclusion within existing frameworks truly served the long-term interests of the community. He argued that visibility without ownership, representation without control, and access without independence were fragile gains. This critique struck a sensitive nerve, as it implied that success measured by proximity to power might still fall short of genuine empowerment for those who had invested careers in navigating established institutions. This perspective could feel like a direct rebuke. His emphasis on accountability also disrupted prevailing narratives around victimhood. Farrakhan did not deny suffering, but he refused to let it define destiny. He spoke of habits, choices, and cultural renewal as essential components of progress, even when those ideas were unpopular. In doing so, he challenged a system that often finds it easier to manage communities through dependency than to encourage autonomy, self-reliance. After all, reduces the need for oversight, intervention, and control. The Million Man March revealed how powerful this message could be when translated into action. Men traveled from across the country, not for spectacle, but for affirmation of responsibility and purpose. The absence of chaos or disorder contradicted expectations, reinforcing the idea that discipline and unity could exist without coercion. This quiet strength proved unsettling precisely because it did not fit prevailing stereotypes or political scripts. Over time, Farrakhan's insistence on self-accountability has remained a fault line. Supporters view it as a necessary correction to cycles of dependency, while critics argue it places too much burden on individuals within unequal systems. Yet the persistence of the debate itself underscores the influence of his ideas. They refuse to fade because they demand something difficult, action without excuses. In the larger narrative, this call for self-reliance ties together the themes that define Farrakhan's legacy. It challenges power externally, unsettles comfort internally, and insists that dignity must be built, not bestowed. Whether embraced or resisted, it remains one of the clearest explanations for why his voice continues to provoke such strong reactions long after the marchers left the National Mall. As the argument deepens, Farrakhan turns toward questions many leaders avoid because they force a reckoning beyond symbolism. He frames separation, reparations, and land justice not as threats, but as responses, measured answers to the possibility that reconciliation, as it has been promised and postponed, may never fully arrive. In his telling, these ideas emerge not from hostility, but from realism shaped by history and experience. If a relationship has been defined by imbalance for generations, he asks, is it unreasonable to consider new terms? Farrakhan does not begin with separation as a first impulse. Instead, he presents it as a conclusion reached after repeated failures to achieve genuine equity. He acknowledges the language of unity that has long dominated public discourse, but he questions whether unity without fairness is anything more than proximity without power. To him, living side by side while remaining economically unequal, politically marginalized, deflowered, and culturally devalued is not true integration, but a softer form of containment. Separation, in this sense, is framed as the right to develop freely, rather than the demand to withdraw in anger. Reparations occupy a similar place in his narrative. Farrakhan does not describe them as charity or punishment, but as recognition. He speaks of unpaid labor, stolen opportunity, and inherited disadvantage as tangible realities, not abstract grievances. From his perspective, societies routinely compensate for harm when it is acknowledged honestly, and the refusal to do so signals not complexity, but unwillingness. Reparations, then, become less about money alone and more about admitting responsibility and restoring dignity. Without that acknowledgement, he argues, reconciliation remains incomplete. Land justice is woven into this vision as both practical and symbolic. Farrakhan emphasizes that land represents independence, sustainability, and the ability to plan beyond survival. A people without control over space, resources, or production are perpetually vulnerable, regardless of legal rights. By raising the issue of land, he challenges a system that encourages participation but resists ownership. The question he poses is quiet but powerful. How can a community be expected to thrive if it never controls the foundation on which it stands? What distinguishes Farrakhan's position is that these demands are paired with an equally firm insistence on internal responsibility. He rejects the idea that justice alone, delivered from outside, will automatically produce renewal. Even if separation were granted, even if reparations were paid, even if land were secured, he argues that progress would still depend on discipline, unity, and purpose. Freedom, in his view, is not a gift that completes the journey, but a condition that exposes character. This dual emphasis unsettles many observers. On one side, his proposals challenge national myths of fairness and closure. On the other, his call for accountability disrupts narratives that place all responsibility elsewhere. Farrakhan insists that both truths must exist at the same time. Injustice has caused deep harm, and healing requires active participation from those who were harmed. To separate these ideas is, in his view, to misunderstand freedom itself. Throughout his speeches, Farrakhan returns to the theme of choice. He argues that black people have the right to decide their future, whether that future involves deeper integration, structured separation, or new forms of autonomy. What he resists most strongly is the illusion of choice being told options exist while outcomes remain fixed. By naming separation and reparations openly, he forces a conversation that many prefer to keep theoretical. This approach explains why his ideas provoke strong resistance. They push beyond reform toward redefinition. They challenge not only policies, but assumptions about who has the authority to propose alternatives. Farrakhan speaks as though self-determination is not something to be requested, but exercised. And that tone alone shifts the balance of power in the discussion. In the larger arc of the story, these arguments complete the framework he has built. Self-reliance, accountability, and dignity are not isolated themes. They converge here, where history meets choice. Farrakhan does not promise an easy resolution. Instead, he presents a demanding vision in which justice and responsibility walk together, and where the future is not inherited, but constructed deliberately. It is this insistence on agency rooted in both memory and resolve that continues to make his message impossible to ignore. Ultimately, the video arrives at a clear and unsettling conclusion. Louis Farrakhan is feared not because of exaggeration or myth, but because he is unapologetic in a world that often rewards silence, compliance, and careful ambiguity. He does not soften his language to gain approval, nor does he reshape his message to fit the expectations of institutions that have historically benefited from black dependence rather than black independence. That refusal to compromise is not accidental. It is central to why his voice continues to resonate, even decades after many expected it to fade. Farrakhan's influence does not come from holding office or controlling policy, but from shaping consciousness. He encourages people to question who defines legitimacy, who benefits from accepted narratives, and who is allowed to speak with authority. In doing so, he shifts the focus from protest alone to political awareness, from reaction to strategy, for supporters. This approach feels empowering because it restores a sense of agency that is often missing from mainstream conversations about progress. For critics, it is unsettling precisely because it cannot be easily managed or redirected. The video makes the case that what truly alarms powerful institutions is not any single policy position, but the independence of thought Farrakhan promotes. He urges Black Americans to look beyond party loyalty, media framing, and symbolic gestures, and to evaluate outcomes rather than promises. That mindset challenges systems built on predictability. A population that thinks independently is harder to divide, harder to pacify, and harder to lead without accountability. In that sense, fear arises not from chaos, but from clarity. Equally important is Farrakhan's consistency. While many public figures adjust their stances with political winds, he has remained largely unchanged in his core principles. This continuity gives his message weight. People may disagree with him, but they cannot easily dismiss him as insincere or opportunistic. Over time, that consistency builds trust among followers and reinforces the perception that his commitment is to a cause rather than a career. The video also emphasizes that Farrakhan speaks to responsibility as much as resistance. He does not frame empowerment as entitlement, but as obligation, economic discipline, moral conduct. And community unity are recurring themes in his message. This combination of critique and self-examination creates a complete framework, one that does not rely solely on external change. That balance is rare, and it complicates attempts to categorize him neatly as either radical or reactionary. In the end, the fear surrounding Farrakhan reflects a deeper anxiety about what happens when marginalized people define their own path forward. His message suggests that liberation is not merely something to be granted, but something to be organized, protected, and sustained. That idea challenges long-standing power dynamics more profoundly than any single demand ever could. As the story closes, the video invites viewers to reflect rather than react, whether one agrees with Farrakhan or not. His impact on political consciousness is undeniable. He forces uncomfortable questions into the open and refuses to let them be dismissed by convenience or distraction. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway. Voices that inspire independent thought will always be met with resistance, not because they are dangerous, but because they are difficult to control. Thank you for taking the time to listen and engage with this story. If you found this perspective thoughtful or illuminating, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who value deeper conversations. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that complex history continues to be explored with honesty and care.